He dropped the divorce papers on the kitchen table like he was slamming a winning hand on a poker table, tipped his head back, and laughed. "You're leaving with the clothes on your back, Alina, nothing else." That was Julian, my husband of 9 years, sneering at me over a folder of legal paperwork while his mother stood behind him nodding along like a proud spectator at a public execution. He genuinely believed our shared checking account, the one with maybe $6,000 in it, was the sum total of everything I had in this world. He had no idea. He had no idea that my late grandfather, a quiet, unassuming man named Walter Hale, had spent 40 years building something neither Julian nor his mother could have imagined in their most feverish dreams. He had no idea that in a sealed trust with my name on it, and only my name, sat commercial buildings, corporate holdings, and treasury bonds worth exactly $28,740,000. He had no idea that the moment a judge unsealed that number in open court, his smug little grin would disappear off his face like it had never existed. And his mother, the woman who once told me I should be grateful just to sit at their table, would go so pale she'd collapse in the courtroom gallery in front of everyone. Stick with me until the end, because the way this played out still gives me chills, and I promise you it's worth every minute. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop the name of your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far a story like this can travel. My name is Alina. This is what happened when the two people who spent years treating me like I was worthless found out, in the worst possible way, exactly how wrong they had been. I met Julian when I was 26, at a mutual friend's engagement party, back when he still knew how to be charming without an audience. He worked in commercial insurance, wore good suits even on ordinary days, and had a way of making a room feel smaller and warmer just by walking into it. I fell for him the way you fall for someone when you've never been shown what a healthy relationship actually looks like, quickly, and without asking enough questions. His mother, Diane, I met 3 months later, over a dinner that lasted 4 uncomfortable hours. She was polished, precise, and immediately, unmistakably unimpressed with me. I came from a small town 2 hours outside the city. My father had been a mechanic. My mother taught elementary school. Diane came from money that had been in her family for 3 generations, and she made sure, in small ways all through that first dinner, that I understood the gap between where I came from and where Julian's family believed they belonged. I told myself it didn't matter. Julian loved me, or said he did, often enough that I believed it, and I thought love was supposed to be enough to close any distance. For the first 2 or 3 years, it was good, or good enough. We got married in a small ceremony that Diane complained was modest, in a tone that made it clear she meant cheap. We bought a house together, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch that I fell in love with the moment I saw it, even though the mortgage stretched us thinner than either of us wanted to admit out loud. Somewhere around year 4, something in Julian shifted. Maybe it had always been there and I simply hadn't been paying close enough attention. He grew more impatient with me, more dismissive in front of his colleagues, quicker to correct me in public over small, meaningless things. How I told a story, how I mispronounced a name, how I ordered at a restaurant. Diane's visits became more frequent, and with them came a steady undercurrent of commentary about everything from my cooking to my clothes, to the fact that I hadn't, in her words, found my footing in a career worth mentioning. I told myself this was just what marriage looked like once the initial excitement faded. I told myself every couple went through rough patches. I told myself, more than anything, that if I was patient enough, understanding enough, quiet enough, things would eventually soften back into what they'd been at the beginning. They never did. By the time we reached our 9th year of marriage, I had stopped expecting things to soften. I had settled instead into a kind of careful, practiced smallness, the version of myself that took up the least space, asked for the least, and absorbed the most. I wasn't a partner in that house. I was furniture. I cooked the meals, kept the calendar, remembered the anniversaries Julian forgot, and smoothed over every argument with his family before it could fully ignite. When his business dinners ran late, I waited up with a plate covered in foil. When his mother visited unannounced, which was often, I rearranged my entire week around her comfort. When I asked for anything, a night out, a say in a financial decision, basic consideration in how we spoke to Eek. Each other, I was met with the same tired refrain. You're overreacting, Elena. Why do you always have to make things difficult? Diane made sure I never forgot my place in that family. She had a genuine gift for delivering insults wrapped in the language of concern. She'd compliment a dinner I'd spent 3 hours preparing and then add, almost as an afterthought, that it was sweet. I had so much free time to cook, since I didn't really contribute financially to the household the way Julian did. She'd mention, at every opportunity, how fortunate I was that Julian had taken a chance on someone like me, someone without the right last name, the right college, the right connections. She said it so often, delivered with such practiced ease, that for a while I nearly started believing her. There was a particular Thanksgiving, in our 7th year, when Diane told the entire extended family, over dessert, that she'd always wondered what exactly Elena brought to this marriage besides being agreeable. Julian laughed along with the room. I remember sitting there with a fork halfway to my mouth, smiling the way you smile when you've trained yourself not to react, feeling something inside me quietly close a door it would never fully reopen. I told myself this was just how families like theirs operated. Old money, old rules, old expectations, and a daughter-in-law who would never quite measure up no matter what she did. I told myself it would get better with time, the way I'd been telling myself that for years. It didn't get better. It got worse, and then, without warning, it ended. The morning it all fell apart started like any other. I remember the smell of coffee, the early light through the kitchen window, the ordinary hum of a Tuesday. I had absolutely no idea I was about to lose the version of my life I had spent 9 years constructing, or that losing it would turn out to be the single best thing that ever happened to me. I walked into the kitchen and found Julian already there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Not anger, something colder. Satisfaction, almost rehearsed. Diane was beside him, arms folded, chin lifted, watching me the way a hawk watches something small moving through the grass. Neither of them said good morning. Julian slid a thick manila envelope across the table toward me without a single word of warning, without any prior conversation, without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement of the 9 years we'd spent building a life together. Sign these, he said. His voice was flat, almost bored, like he was asking me to sign for a delivery. I'm filing for divorce. I've already moved the joint funds into my own account. The car titles are in my name now too. You can take your clothes, that's it. I stood there staring down at the papers, waiting for my body to do something, cry, shake, scream, anything that would match the size of what he'd just said. Instead, something strange happened. A stillness settled over me, a calm so complete it almost frightened me. Diane let out a short, satisfied laugh, the kind you give when a plan comes together exactly as designed. Think of it as a mercy, dear, she said, examining her manicure. You were always living on borrowed time in this family anyway. We all knew this day was coming. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't give either of them the reaction they were so clearly hungry for. Because in that moment, my mind wasn't on Julian, or on Diane, or on the papers sitting on the table between us. It was on my grandfather. My grandfather Walter was, by every outward appearance, an unremarkable man. He drove a truck older than I was. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation for as long as I could remember. He ate dinner at 5:30 sharp and was in bed by 9. If you passed him on the street, you would never in 100 years have guessed what he was actually worth. But Walter Hale had a mind built for patience and discipline, and he understood something most people never learn. That money says almost nothing about a person's character, but the way people treat you when they believe you have none says everything. He grew up with very little. His own father had lost the family's small hardware store during a recession Walter never talked about in detail, only in the lessons it had left behind. Walter spent his 20s working 2 jobs, saving what most people would have called an insultingly small amount, and investing it with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He never chased anything flashy. He bought overlooked commercial properties in neighborhoods everyone else had written off, held quiet minority stakes in small companies run by people he trusted, and reinvested nearly everything for decades instead of spending it. He never told anyone, not even my mother, the full scope of what he'd built. He used to say that money changes how people look at you long before it changes anything about who you actually are, and he had no interest in being looked at differently. 6 months before he passed away, he called me over to his small, plain house on a quiet street, nothing about it hinting at what he'd spent decades quietly assembling. He set a sealed leather portfolio on the table between us and looked at me with an intensity I had never seen from him before. People show you who they really are, he told me, the moment they believe you have nothing left to offer them. Remember that, Elena. Watch closely. It will tell you everything you need to know about a person, faster than years of pleasant conversation ever could. He explained that everything he'd built, every property, every quiet investment, every careful decision across 4 decades, had to remain completely confidential until the law required it to be disclosed. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, he said, but because he wanted whatever happened next in my life to unfold honestly. He wanted to know, in whatever time he had left, that the people around me loved me, not the idea of what I might one day inherit. I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. I understand it completely now. 2 weeks after his funeral, his estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Michael Sorensen, called and asked me to come in privately. I sat in a quiet office on a gray afternoon while a stack of sealed documents was opened in front of me and my breath caught somewhere in my chest. Commercial real estate spread across 3 states. Corporate holdings he'd built over decades without a single person outside that office ever knowing. Liquid treasury bonds accumulated slowly and patiently, year after year, decade after decade. All of it folded into an ironclad private trust, structured entirely and irrevocably in my name alone, protected from any claim outside my own signature. $28,740,000. I sat in that office and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief, mixed with a strange, quiet resolve. My grandfather had spent his whole life being underestimated by people who never bothered to look past his flannel shirts and his old truck, and in his final gift to me, he had handed me the exact same test. The chance to watch, quietly, who in my life would treat me the same way whether I had nothing or everything. Sitting across from Julian's divorce papers weeks later, I understood precisely what Walter had meant, and what he'd hoped I would do with it. I wasn't going to fight his petty, greedy little settlement. I wasn't going to argue over a checking account, or a mortgaged house, or 2 cars that had never really mattered to me in the first place. I was going to let him build his own trap, one arrogant brick at a time, and then step back and watch him walk directly into it. What followed were 2 of the strangest, most surreal weeks of my life. Julian didn't treat the upcoming divorce hearing like the ending of a 9-year marriage. He treated it like a victory lap he'd been waiting years to run. He told his friends, loudly and often, that he was finally free of what he called dead weight. He took clients and colleagues out to expensive dinners to celebrate his supposed liberation, charging every meal to credit cards he fully expected to pay off easily once the house and cars were solely his, and there was no longer a second income to consider, however modest that second income had actually been. His attorney, a sharp, well-dressed man named Preston Cole, sent over settlement demand after settlement demand, and each one grew more audacious than the last. Julian wanted the house, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought together 7 years earlier, still carrying a hefty mortgage that had always assumed 2 incomes. He wanted both cars. He wanted every piece of shared furniture, down to the bookshelves I'd spent an entire weekend building and staining myself. And to make absolutely sure I left with nothing, he insisted I sign away any right to spousal support, alimony, or future claims on his income. Permanently, in writing, with no exceptions and no room for renegotiation later. I remember reading through the first draft of that settlement alone at the kitchen table, late one night, and feeling almost nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a strange, clinical distance, like I was reading about someone else's life. Diane came by the house one afternoon, ostensibly to help oversee the exchange of paperwork, though what she really wanted was a front-row seat to watching me pack. She stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, arms crossed, watching with a small, satisfied smile as I folded my clothes into 2 modest suitcases. "You should start looking at studio apartments now," she said, handing me a folder of settlement documents like she was doing me a genuine favor. Somewhere out past the highway, maybe. Prices in town are only going to keep climbing, and you'll want to get ahead of it before it's too late. I said nothing. I didn't defend myself. I didn't push back on a single line of the settlement, no matter how unreasonable it became. With a steady hand, I signed the preliminary waivers, giving up any claim to Julian's modest accounts, his heavily mortgaged house, and the 2 cars sitting in our driveway. He took the signed papers from me with a look of pure triumph on his face, completely convinced he had won something enormous. He had no idea he was quietly closing the door on the only version of his future that could have included any kind of long-term financial security. The night before the final hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat out on the back porch of a house that no longer felt like mine, looking up at a sky full of more stars than usual, and I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the way he used to sit exactly where I was sitting, on his own porch, telling me stories about the hardware store his father lost, and the years he'd spent rebuilding something out of almost nothing. I thought about the leather portfolio, and the way his hands had rested on top of it, steady and sure, when he told me to watch closely and remember what I saw. I wasn't nervous about the hearing itself. I had already signed away every material thing Julian wanted. Legally, materially, there was nothing left for either of us to fight over in that courtroom except the formality of ending it. What I felt instead was something closer to anticipation. Not for revenge, exactly, but for the truth to finally exist in the open, the way my grandfather had always intended it eventually would. I packed my folder of disclosure documents carefully into my bag, checked it twice, and finally went inside to try to sleep for a few hours before the morning came. The morning of the final hearing came in under a flat, colorless sky. Courtroom 4 of the county family court was hushed in that particular way courtrooms are, the low click of keyboards, the occasional cough, the sense of 100 small dramas being processed in careful, procedural order, one after another, all morning long. Julian arrived looking like a man who had already won some kind of tournament. New suit, new watch, a confidence in his walk that bordered on theatrical. Preston Cole walked beside him, exuding the same practiced smugness, a leather folio tucked neatly under one arm. Behind them, in the front row of the gallery, Diane sat fanning herself with a folded piece of paper, wearing an expression somewhere between triumph and open glee. I walked in alone. Simple black dress, low heels, no jewelry except the small gold ring my grandfather had given me for my 25th birthday. In my hands, I carried nothing but a single sealed folder. The court-mandated financial disclosure my grandfather's estate attorneys had filed with the court that morning, along with the certified trust documentation. I took my seat at the respondent's table and folded my hands calmly in front of me. Julian leaned toward me, just close enough that only I could hear him. "Ready to start over from nothing, Elena," he murmured, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I didn't answer him. I looked straight ahead. Judge Elena Kaplan took the bench a few minutes later, her expression composed and unreadable as the clerk called our case number. Preston Cole rose almost immediately, eager to move things along, painting a picture of me as a woman with no independent means and no career of note, requesting the court expedite approval of a settlement I had, after all, willingly signed weeks earlier. Judge Kaplan listened without interruption, her pen moving occasionally across a legal pad in front of her. Then she reached for a sealed folder that had been filed with the court that morning, the one containing the certified disclosure from my grandfather's estate. The room went quiet as she broke the seal. Judge Kaplan adjusted her glasses. Her eyes moved slowly across the page in front of her, and for a long moment, nobody in the courtroom moved. The silence stretched on so long that Preston Cole eventually cleared his throat, clearly expecting the judge to simply sign off and move along to the next case on her crowded docket. Instead, she looked up. Her gaze settled first on Julian, then on his attorney, sharp and unreadable. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice carrying easily through the still courtroom, "your client has submitted a settlement in which he retains a $400,000 mortgaged property, both vehicles, and the entirety of the marital furnishings, while the respondent waives any claim to spousal support. apparently under the belief that she is being left with essentially nothing. "That's correct, Your Honor," Cole replied smoothly. "Both parties agreed to the terms in good faith." "Then I assume," Judge Kaplan continued, tapping the folder in front of her, "that your client understands exactly what he's giving up. Beck. Oz according to the certified estate records of Walter Hale, unsealed and filed with this court this morning, Mrs. Voss is the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable, non-marital private trust, comprised of commercial real estate holdings, corporate equity, and liquid treasury bonds, with a certified value of exactly $28,740,000. The pen in Preston Cole's hand slipped from his fingers and clattered against the table. His face drained of color in an instant. Julian half rose out of his chair. That's not possible. Her grandfather drove a pickup truck. He wore the same shirt every week. There's no way." The bailiff signaled for him to sit back down. Behind him, I heard Diane make a strangled, disbelieving sound. When the full reality of what she'd just heard finally landed, the number, the finality of it, everything she and Julian had thrown away with their own hands, by their own choice, weeks earlier, her eyes rolled back and she went down in the aisle, sending a stack of papers scattering across the courtroom floor. Bailiffs rushed forward. Someone called for paramedics. For several long minutes, the courtroom dissolved into controlled chaos while Diane was helped out, dazed and trembling, on the arm of a court officer, her earlier composure completely gone. When the room finally settled again, everything had changed. Julian sat frozen at the petitioner's table, his chest rising and falling too quickly, his eyes darting between me, the judge, and his visibly shaken attorney, as though searching for some version of this morning where the last 5 minutes hadn't just happened. Cole rose again, his earlier confidence completely gone, his voice noticeably unsteady. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, we'd like to request an immediate continuance. My client wishes to withdraw the petition entirely. We'd ask the court to allow both parties time to pursue counseling and renegotiate the terms in good faith, given what appears to be a significant misunderstanding of the circumstances." Julian leaned forward, sweat visible along his hairline. "Elena, please, we don't need to do this. This was a misunderstanding, that's all it was. We can talk about this outside, just the two of us. We're still a family." 9 years, Elena, doesn't that count for something? I looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years without any illusions clouding the picture, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not rage. Not satisfaction, exactly. Just a clean, quiet sense of closure, the kind that comes only after you've stopped waiting for someone to become a different person. "There's nothing to discuss," I said, turning back to the bench. "He filed this petition believing he was leaving me with nothing, and every single term in that settlement was his idea, not mine, drafted by his own attorney and demanded in writing. I consent to the dissolution exactly as it stands." Judge Kaplan brought her gavel down with a sharp, final crack. "Motion to withdraw is denied," she said. "Mr. Voss, you executed binding, notarized waivers forfeiting any claim to spousal support, to renegotiation, and to any interest whatsoever in your wife's separate property. Mr. Hale's trust was established and fully funded well before these proceedings began, and under the law it remains entirely outside the marital estate, regardless of the timing of its disclosure. The settlement stands exactly as signed." I watched the full weight of what he'd done finally land on Julian's face, second by second, like watching color drain from a photograph. In his hurry to leave me with nothing, in his rush to feel like the winner of a contest I had never actually been playing, he had permanently and irreversibly locked himself out of $28.7 million. Walking away instead with a mortgaged house he could barely afford a loan, and a mountain of dinner party credit card debt he had run up celebrating a victory that had never existed. I walked out of that courthouse alone, and the morning air outside felt different than it had in years, lighter, cleaner, entirely mine. Behind me, I could hear Julian on the marble steps, arguing in a low, frantic voice with Cole, already beginning to grasp the true size of what he'd just lost. The house he'd fought so hard to keep came with a mortgage payment that had always depended on 2 incomes, not one. The car payments were the same. The credit card balances from all those celebratory dinners were still due in full, regardless of who ended up with the furniture. I didn't look back. I got into my car, sat behind the wheel for a long moment in silence, and then simply drove away. Within 6 months, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Julian had been forced to sell the house at a loss and move into a small rental on the very outskirts of town. Diane had once so casually told me to look into working longer hours than he ever had during our entire marriage, just to keep his head above water. Diane, from what I understand, moved in with him for a time, the two of them navigating a version of financial strain neither had ever experienced firsthand. I didn't feel joy about any of that. Mostly, I felt the strange, settled peace of watching a chapter of my life close on its own, without me ever having to force anything or raise my voice a single time. I used my grandfather's legacy to build something quiet and entirely my own. I bought a small house near the coast, the kind of place with wide windows and the sound of the ocean drifting in at night. I hired a small team to help manage the properties Walter had spent his life assembling, learning the business slowly and carefully, the same way he had. I started an educational foundation in his name, funding scholarships for first-generation college students. Kids who, like him, might otherwise spend their whole lives being underestimated by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see what they were actually capable of. I traveled a little. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift away during the years I'd spent making myself smaller. I learned slowly what it actually felt like to build a life on my own terms, answering to no one, apologizing for nothing. My grandfather used to tell me that quiet dignity will always outlast loud arrogance in the end. That when people try to dig a pit for you out of greed or contempt, sometimes the wisest thing you can do is step back, stay silent, and simply let them fall into it themselves. I think about that conversation on his porch more often now than I ever expected to. I think about the way he set that leather portfolio down between us, and the quiet certainty in his voice when he told me to watch closely and remember what I saw. He was right, he usually was. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why he chose to build his life the way he did, so carefully, so quietly, giving away almost nothing about himself to anyone except through the choices he made when no one was watching. But I understand now exactly why he wanted me to inherit not just the money, but the lesson buried underneath it. Because the money changed my circumstances. The lesson changed how I see people. So now I want to hear from you. If you'd been in my position, would you have revealed the inheritance the moment those divorce papers hit the table? Or would you have let the truth come out exactly the way I did, in front of a judge, in front of everyone, on your own terms and in your own time? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more real, powerful stories like this one. I've got 2 more waiting for you right now. Click either one and I'll see you there. There's someone I haven't mentioned yet, and she deserves a place in this story, because she saw the truth of my marriage long before I was ready to admit it to myself. Her name is Priya, and we'd been friends since college, back before Julian, back before Diane's dinner parties and her carefully aimed comments, back when I still believed relationships were supposed to feel effortless most of the time, instead of like a job you were constantly failing to do well enough. Priya came to visit maybe 8 months before the divorce papers landed on the kitchen table. We sat out on that same back porch, drinking wine that had gone slightly too warm, and at some point in the evening, she set her glass down and looked at me in a way she never had before. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it," she said. "You don't talk like yourself anymore. You talk like someone constantly bracing for the next correction. When did that happen?" I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her marriage was complicated, that every long relationship had its rough patches, that she was reading too much into a few offhand comments from Diane that didn't really mean anything. She didn't push it that night, but she also didn't let it go entirely. Over the months that followed, in phone calls and the occasional visit, she kept gently, persistently pointing out things I had trained myself not to see, the way I apologized reflexively for things that weren't my fault, the way I'd stopped making plans without first checking whether they'd fit around Julian's schedule, the way I flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever Diane's name came up in conversation. When I finally called her the afternoon the divorce papers appeared on our kitchen table, I expected her to be shocked. She wasn't. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years," she told me quietly. "I'm sorry it happened this way. I'm not sorry it happened." Priya was the only person outside of Michael Sorensen's office who knew about the trust before that hearing. I told her everything, sitting in her kitchen 2 nights before the final court date, and she listened without a single interruption until I finished. "Shed. Are you going to tell him beforehand?" she asked. "Give him a chance to back out gracefully." I thought about it for a long time before I answered her. He didn't give me the courtesy of a conversation before he decided to end 9 years of marriage over breakfast, I said. He doesn't get advance warning either. My grandfather wanted me to let people show me who they really are. Julian already showed me. I'm just going to let the rest of the world see it too. Priya sat with me in the courtroom gallery that morning, a few rows behind Diane, and she was the first person I called once I was back in my car, driving away from that courthouse for the last time. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just said, "Now go build something that's actually yours." I think about that conversation almost as often as I think about the one with my grandfather. The educational foundation I started in Walter's name began small, a handful of scholarships for first-generation college students at the state school 2 towns over from where he'd grown up, funded quietly, without any public announcement or press attention. That was intentional. I didn't want recognition. I wanted the same kind of quiet, patient impact my grandfather had spent his whole life building. Within the first year, the foundation had funded full tuition for 11 students. By the second year, that number had grown, and I'd started sitting in on interviews with applicants, listening to kids talk about parents who worked 2 and 3 jobs, about being the first in their family to even consider a 4-year degree, about the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by teachers, by classmates, by entire institutions that had already decided what they were capable of before giving them a real chance to prove otherwise. I recognized something in almost every one of those conversations. Not the specifics of their circumstances, mine were different, but the underlying experience of being quietly written off by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see the whole picture. One student, a young woman named Camilla studying structural engineering, told me during her interview that her guidance counselor had once suggested she consider something more realistic than a 4-year engineering program. She said it without any particular anger in her voice, just a flat, practiced acceptance that had clearly been shaped by years of hearing some version of the same message. I thought about Diane, standing in my old bedroom doorway telling me to look into studio apartments on the outskirts of town. I thought about Julian's easy, dismissive laugh over 9 years of small corrections in front of other people. I signed off on Camilla's full scholarship that same afternoon. My grandfather never got to see any of this. He passed before I fully understood what he'd built, let alone what I would eventually do with it. But I like to think he would have approved, not of the money changing hands, exactly, but of what it was quietly being used to prove. That the people who overlook you rarely turn out to be right about you in the end. It's been a little over 2 years now since I walked out of that courthouse. I still live in the house near the coast, the one with the wide windows and the sound of the ocean at night. Priya visits most months, and we sit on the porch with wine that's usually still warm by the time we remember to drink it, and neither of us has to brace for anything. I heard, secondhand and without much interest, that Julian eventually remarried, someone from his office apparently, and that Diane has, according to mutual acquaintances, softened considerably now that there's a mortgage payment she genuinely has to think about. I don't know if any of that is true, and I've realized, somewhat to my own surprise, that I don't especially care either way. What I do care about is the foundation, which has now funded scholarships for over 60 students. I care about the quiet, steady work of learning to manage what my grandfather built, one careful decision at a time, the same patient way he approached it for 40 years before me. I care about the fact that I no longer flinch, even slightly, at the sound of anyone's name. My grandfather used to say that character reveals itself fastest in the moments when someone believes they have nothing left to lose by showing you who they really are. Julian and Diane showed me exactly who they were, freely and without hesitation, the morning they thought I had nothing. I've spent every day since then building a life that has absolutely nothing to do with either of them, and everything to do with the quiet, patient lessons of a man in a flannel shirt who understood, better than almost anyone I've ever known, that the truth always finds its way into the light eventually. You just have to be patient enough to let it. So now, truly, I want to hear from you. If you'd been in my position, would you have revealed T? He inheritance the moment those divorce papers hit the table, or would you have let the truth come out exactly the way I did, in front of a judge, in front of everyone, on your own terms and in your own time? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more real, powerful stories like this one. I've got 2 more waiting for you right now. Click either one and I'll see you there.